Good morning, everyone. I almost forgot to unmute myself there. So we're going to be doing what the recipe calls stewed parsnips, which off the top of your head, you might think that doesn't sound very appealing, but actually this is a very simple, very tasty recipe. I have already peeled my parsnips this morning just to help us run a little bit smoother, but there will be time in here, plenty for you to peel your parsnips, and we'll get to that. But the first thing I am going to do—
Hey, Laura, I put that recipe on screen so people can see it.
Awesome. Oh, perfect. Thank you. I was going to say was before I even read this, I'm actually going to start boiling my water because my stovetop's a little bit old and it takes a little time to get going. So let me just turn that on, and then we'll take a look at our recipe and give that a nice read. So to stew parsnips, scrape them clean from the dirt, boil them tender, cut them into slices, put them in a saucepan with cream enough for a sauce, a piece of butter rolled in flour, a little salt, and shake the saucepan often. When the cream boils, pour them into the plate for a corner dish or a side dish at supper. And this is from Susanna Carter's The Frugal Housewife from 1796. So this is a really typical recipe for parsnips, to be perfectly honest. And one thing that you might be surprised to see is that they mention, dirt, first of all. Today our recipes usually assume that you have washed your food. Back then, though, they're not making that assumption. But they also mention boiling them first and then cutting them. And we see a lot of recipes from this period for things like parsnips that call for you to boil them and then do your peeling and cutting. Now, today, we're doing the reverse, and there's a good reason for that. One is that it's just like peeling a carrot. It's very simple. You don't have to boil it before you peel it. However, you can do the boil, then peel, and it comes off very easily in that way because it's already separated a little bit from the meat of the parsnip underneath. However, it's very, very, very hot once you take it out of that boiling water, and you would need to ice it off just a little bit before that. So in lieu of that, we've gone for the simpler option that we hope will be satisfactory to most of our participants of peeling and chopping them, then boiling them. I know Lacey and I actually talked this morning about strategies for doing your 18th century style boiling. Lacey, did you want to share your thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that Laura and I talked about is I've done this before, and I think it's likely that others would do this as well, that you boil something like the parsnips and then cut them out of the hot water, dunk them in an ice bath or cold water, just enough to cool the outside of the parsnip. And then use your fingers or a knife to peel. So the center of the parsnip still stays really hot, but the outside is cool enough for you to touch. Now, Laura, we also have some questions about the parsnips themselves. Could you hold one up to the ingredients cam so we can see it a little better?
Yeah. So I'll pick this guy. So again, I've already peeled mine, and I'm going to do my best to hold it up to the camera well with my limited view. So I'll hold the end up. You can see that the end here is this kind of tan color. And when I peeled it, you can really easily see the inside is very white by comparison. And so that's how you know you've gotten through that peeling layer. It's not like a carrot where it's kind of the same color all the way through. And sometimes you go, did I actually peel that? This one's very obvious to tell. And they can come in all different sizes. I'll pull back a little bit so you can see this one's pretty long. I had another one in here that was a little bit shorter and smaller. I couldn't hear you.
Keep holding them up there for a second. I'm going to take down the screen share so people can see them just a little bit better. Give me just 1 second.
Absolutely. I will tell you that they smell divine. They are a very sweet, kind of, it's hard to explain, but if you've never had parsnips before, they are a little bit on the sweet side, which makes them really nice for the cream sauce that we're going to make. So very careful.
Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, of course. So as you're peeling them and you get ready to be able to chop them, we're going to cut them in fairly small pieces, and this is going to help us move along with our boiling time. Because again, if you boil them whole, it'll take longer because it's trying to permeate all of this space. Now, the other good thing about cutting them before boiling them is the top of the parsnip here is much larger than the smaller part of the parsnip here. And so by cutting them, we're making it more of a uniform size. Now, uh-oh, where'd my knife go? Oh, here it is. So I'm going to just cut them into, here, let me move my bowl so that way you all can see. I just realized. All right, hopefully everyone has a fairly decent view. So the very end of it, you'll want to just cut off because it's kind of extra tough and just not super pleasant. And same thing with the top end of it here, where if it was still in the ground, there would be leaves, just cut that right off the top. And then you can just set those aside. And so for this part, we're cutting it in coins that are about 1/2 inch. So, so you can hopefully see about how thick they are. So we don't want them huge. We don't need them teeny tiny either. Of course, if you like your parsnips, you know, very soft, you could cut them smaller and boil them for longer. I like mine with a little bit of body to them. And then you just go on through and cut them on down.
Laura or Rachel. Rachel is also joining us here today as one of our hearth cooks. Would you tell us a little bit about parsnips and why we chose parsnips for March doing History in the Kitchen?
Hey, Rachel, do you want this one or would you like me to start?
Yeah, Rachel's having some technical difficulties. Go ahead and start, Laura.
Okay, so it's not just because I love parsnips, although that is a big part of it, and any excuse I get to cook parsnips for public programs, I take. But also because this is really a great time of year for parsnips. Now, imagine if you are a tenant farmer and it's March, it's very late in the winter and not yet quite spring. And so you are going to be eating things that are left over from your larder or your pantry or your root cellar that have made it all the way through the winter. And that typically is root vegetables. So things like potatoes and parsnips, which do really well with a long-term storage. And so these are the kinds of things that are quite versatile in your repertoire of recipes. You can cook these in a lot of different ways. And so they make really good eating when you are having to stretch out your supplies. So these come up in the fall, or these are ready for harvest in the fall, I should say. But they are a plant you have to have patience with. I grew parsnips in my home garden last year, and you plant them in the spring, and then they have to sit there. You do not get to have any kind of instant gratification with these. And so by the time the fall comes, you then finally have your parsnips. But the nice thing about them too is that they are in everyone food. This is a very egalitarian food because anyone can grow them.
They were eaten by pretty much everybody in the 18th century. People who were enslaved, people who owned their own farms, but they weren't plantations. But this is a recipe that is really accessible to someone who does own their own farm. It's parsnips in fancy forms. I saw we had somebody mention parsnips fried up into a cake, like a latke or a potato pancake, that kind of thing. You might see something like that on the Mason's table, whereas we've got these beautiful boiled parsnips that we're going to make, representing something that might have been eaten by someone who was a farmer.
Yeah, there's even a recipe I've seen for parsnip fritters, which at some point I will make. And I don't know how they'll turn out, but we see all kinds of recipes. But another thing that's cool about parsnips too is parsnips are a very old vegetable in the European recipe books. They go back to the medieval period. This is something that the English would have been eating for a long time. And so this is one of those vegetables that gets brought from England to North America with them. That's a familiar vegetable. So while they readily take to cooking with corn and potatoes, which are introduced by Native Americans to the Europeans, this is something that they were already eating in Europe. And so they maintain their status as a staple food for both, you know, this working class of people and the nobility alike. So I've got all of my parsnips chopped now, and my water is not quite at a boil yet, but it is starting to bubble. You might be able to see the steam coming off of it. So we're going to give it just a little bit longer because we do want it at a good boil. And I did toss a little bit of salt in there. You might have seen me sprinkle some salt in. And that just helps the flavor a little bit. You'll notice in our recipe, it says a little salt. It's very open to interpretation, which is typical of these recipes. And so I like to put in a little bit while I boil, and then I'm not going to put in any salt until later when I make my cream sauce, and then I decide if I actually need more salt. Is Rachel been able?
Yeah, Rachel's on here, and I'm curious about, I know both you and Rachel have had experience studying and cooking and talking about people who are tenant farmers. Rachel, tell us if you have any other thoughts about parsnips or root vegetables, or what it's like to, you know, cook at this time of year when you can't just go to the grocery store and buy a sack of potatoes.
You are eating a lot of root vegetables, and you are just waiting for those peas and those first lettuces to come up for anything green and fresh, because you are so tired. And I love potatoes. I love potatoes more than anything in the world. But even at this point during the year, when I was going home from the tenant farm to the, you know, my actual home, I was still tired of potatoes because it's just, you were eating potatoes for every meal, potatoes with other root vegetables in every form, and just dying for something fresh and watching that garden.
Where yeah, we were, when we worked at this tenant farm, we tried, actually, hold on one second and then I'll continue the thought. So my water is at a boil, beautifully so. You may be able to see it on the ingredients cam. So I am going to go ahead and put in my parsnips, but I'll hold it up one last time before I slip them in so you can see, ta-da, all my beautiful parsnips. And so we're just going to go ahead and put those on in.
And like Laura said, those look a lot like carrots, white carrots, but they...
Uh-oh, we lost you.
I somehow muted myself. But so they look like carrots, but they have a much sweeter flavor, a little bit of a different tang than carrots do.
And so now that they're in to boil, I put my lid back on just to help keep all that heat in, but you don't need to have the lid on. I'm just trying to help it cook along a little faster. It'll take about 10 minutes to cook. Just like potatoes, you really don't want them to be underdone. Otherwise, they just don't taste right. And they've got kind of this hard, lumpy texture that's not very enjoyable. So just make sure you really let it sit for 10 minutes. So my eyes on our clock here. And we'll talk a little bit more about parsnips, and then I'll talk a little bit about our cream sauce that we're gonna make. But as Rachel was saying, yeah, when you think about it, you know, these tenant farmers are stocking up in the fall with the knowledge that there's some things you can cook or you can grow in the winter. There are some winter crops, but not very many compared to things that you harvest in the summer and the fall. And so you have to stretch the supply out. You have to make sure that you are going to get through the winter. And then this time in March and then coming into April, you know that those new greens are going to come up very soon. And it's almost worse than in the middle of the winter, where you haven't been eating everything for quite so long. And by the time you get to March, it's this feeling of, oh my goodness, we're so close to having greens.
And in January, it's so cold. You're like, all right, I'm a little tired of potatoes, but also it's cold. But by March, you're like, especially in Virginia, you know, it was 72 here the other day and you're like really ready for those spring vegetables. And Cheryl commented that I live in central Alberta, Canada, and was told to leave the parsnips in the ground over the winter to sweeten them up.
Yes, you will read often, do not pick your parsnips until after frost. And that is because when the frost hits, it gets very cold and the plants are doing their plant thing. I'll try to explain this as best I can. This would be a great moment for Ryan to be on our program and explain it in a much more scientific way. But essentially, when the frost hits, these plants recognize that, uh-oh, winter's here, and they release sugars. And so that's the sweetness that you're tasting in the parsnips. And so you can pick them before frost, but they won't taste as good. If you wait till after frost and pick them in the middle of the winter, for instance, yeah, they'll be a lot sweeter. But they are definitely a crop, like I said, that takes patience because they do have a very long growing period. Potatoes can come in fairly quickly. Parsnips make you wait for it. They're a low and slow plant, but I think it's okay.
Speaking of parsnips, we had a question about whether or not you could eat them raw like carrots.
Yes, I suppose you could. I've personally not done it. I know that you should not eat the greens from them. However, the greens produce a chemical that can make you sick. So while you might be able to eat the root part raw, do not eat the greens from it, which is a shame because there's a lot of other plants you can eat both the root and the green, but not parsnips. No, that's interesting though. I'll have to look into that. I'm so used to cooking them that I hadn't thought about eating them raw.
Admittedly, I snack on them when I'm cooking. So I'll be slicing them up, getting ready to roast them or whatever, and I'll, chuck a couple of slices in my mouth as I'm cooking. I don't typically eat them that way. They're okay. They've got they've got a taste to them that I don't love when they're raw, and I tend to eat them more when they're fully cooked.
I'm just pulling off the lid for a second so you can see I've got it really boiling in here. And so you really want to have them cooking very well. Like I said, you don't want these to be underdone. Otherwise they get a little crunchy. And if you're expecting something nice and soft and you get crunchy instead, it's not a good taste. All right. So we've talked a little bit about parsnips and why they're important. So the cream sauce, which you may not have had before. With something like parsnips, but parsnips, like we said earlier, are something that comes in all sorts of forms, which is really great. And this cream sauce is so simple. And it's something you could definitely use with other vegetables. It is just 4 ingredients. That's how easy it is. We've got butter here, and it's just 2 tablespoons. So I'll chop it up in just in a few minutes here, just to cut it into smaller bits. We have 2 tablespoons of flour as well. And then we've got my little thing of salt here. Like I said, I can add a little bit as I see fit. So not much at all. And then my last thing here, which I'm not going to,
but I'm also looking at
cream. This is half a cup of cream. So you can use heavy cream, you can use whipping cream, you can use, if you are going into your fridge and being like, oh, what do I got? You can use whole milk. It does not have to be cream itself, just a dairy product, and it's going to bind all of this together. But the cream, of course, will make it much richer.
I will mention that I did, for those of you who have dietary restrictions, make this completely gluten and dairy free. I could taste my almond milk, that is what it is. But it worked just fine using a gluten-free flour, dairy-free butter. So you can sub in whatever you need to for your dietary restrictions if that is a challenge that you have.
And that's undoubtedly something that they would do in period, is substitute things needed. I know I've done that before when cooking recipes on the farm, and I think I'm going to find one thing, and then I discovered that my pantry is bare. And so you pivot and you use something else. So if you don't have white flour, you could use whole wheat flour. It won't look as nice and white. And of course, you'll taste like whole wheat, but it'll still do the act of binding that you need it to do. But yeah, there fortunately is wiggle room here for these ingredients. We've just chosen to do the sort of original set for this particular demo, but Lacey often tests our recipes with alternate ingredients to see how they hold up, and quite often it works pretty well.
In large part because I'm gluten-free and dairy doesn't agree with me either. So I want to know if I can eat them. I do make these recipes in the original format as much as possible. So I make plenty of things that I can't eat, but there are some of them that I want to try. So I figure out how I can make them so that I can eat them.
I realized that my cutting block away too soon because I am going to go ahead and chop my butter up a little bit because my cooking time is coming up on the end, and we've left this butter out so it's nice and soft, so it makes it very easy to cut, which is completely fine because it's all going to get melted anyway, so do not worry about perfection. But this just gets cut up into smallish pieces. Like I said, it's a little melty because we've left it out and our kitchen's pretty warm. But there we go. Now I can put my knife away. And what we're actually going to do is take our butter and mix it in with the flour. So I'm going to put my flour in, I'll bring it up here, in the bowl. And then I'm going to put my butter in. And we're just going to toss them together so that way the butter becomes coated with the flour. Super easy. And I didn't even put all my flour in there. I'm holding a little bit back because when I make my cream sauce, I'm going to decide how thick I want it. And if I put less flour, it'll be a thinner sauce. If I put more flour in, it'll be a thicker sauce. So start thinner, and you can always add a little bit more in. All right, so there we go. And I'll hold this up so you can see. Ta-da. So my butter in here, so like here's a piece of butter. It's just been coated with flour, just nice and gentle, nothing fancy.
We've had a couple of thoughts and questions, Laura. One, can you use cornstarch? And Gail, you could, it would work a little bit differently. This method works a little bit better with butter and flour, whether that's wheat flour or something like a rice flour. It would probably work with cornstarch, but you might want to skip the butter and just thicken the cream with the cornstarch slurry. Also, if you are doing this recipe with kids, it is totally okay for the butter to totally get mashed in and together in the flour. You've got a paste of butter and flour. That is something that we see happening in a lot of 18th century recipes.
Like I said, mine is not neat at all. Mine is very, they are lumps and bumps, and that is perfectly fine. All right, so I am at 10 minutes now with my parsnips. So what I'm gonna do is scoop in here, and wow, that went much better than it usually does. I'm pulling out a parsnip so that way I can test it. And I'm gonna use a fork and just pierce it. And it goes through super easy, like that, beautifully right through the center. So my parsnips are done. So we're gonna drain them off. So I have little sieve, little colander here. And so I'm gonna pop over to the sink for a second and drain these, and then I'll be back for the cream sauce.
Gail, I think that cornstarch and flour just have different cooking techniques. Cornstarch you usually add at the end of a cooking process rather than flour at the beginning. So I think it's just a question of how this recipe is written. It will work for flour. So you'd have to sort of do a little testing. Does that make sense, Lacey? I feel like cornstarch you add at the end versus at the beginning.
All right, so I put my parsnips back in, and now I've got my cream. Putting my cream in, putting it back on the stove. Now I've turned down my stove so that way nothing gets scalded by accident. And then let me get my, so I'm just gonna stir up a little bit so that way my parsnips get kind of coated. And now I'm gonna take that flour and butter, pour it on in.
And the method that Laura is using, adding the cream first and then the butter and flour, is an 18th century one. They added the liquid first and then the butter and flour mixture. Today, most of us would dump that butter and flour into the pot first to make what is called a roux, and then add the liquid. So we're just using the 18th century method. If you'd rather do it the other way around, it works just as well.
So it's already come together beautifully. So it's nice and creamy, but I know that butter needs to melt completely, so I'm gonna let it keep going a little bit longer. And if you look at this and you think, well, it's a bit thick for me, I like my sauces a little bit thinner, you can add a little bit more cream in there. Completely fine. This is about you. This is about you and your personal preferences. So if it's your food, make it the way you want it.
Laura, Rachel, we have a question in the chat about canning and as a method of preserving. Can you tell us a little bit more about how people of that sort of working class in the 18th century were going about preserving their food over the winter?
We can pickle that.
So much pickling. Oh man. No. So a great example of this is a lot of us who do 18th century cooking will use a very common cookbook from the period, Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery. And if you flip to the index, it is not perfectly in alphabetical order, by the way, but she does have a section about pickling. And it starts about halfway down one page, finishes the page, goes to the next page, and then fills another half a page. So it's about a full page's worth of where you can find pickle recipes in her cookbook. And it includes not only your standard cucumbers, but it also includes things like beets, which you may be familiar with, and of course, cabbage. But it also mentions things like pickled beef and pickled ham.
Oysters.
Oysters, yeah, oysters. Yeah, there are so many recipes for pickling. So stick it in vinegar and let it sit. Now, they did
how were they stored?
I was gonna, yeah, that was where my next thing was going. So I'm gonna turn down my heat to low because I have this pretty much all together. And my coworkers and I are gonna eat this, so I don't want it to go cold, but it really doesn't need to cook any longer. So people with pickling could store it in stoneware. So this is pottery essentially. And then you can seal up the top with a cork, or if it's a wide jug, you can apply, how do I want to phrase this? You can take a waxed piece of cloth and put it over the top and tie it very tight, and it creates a seal. So they don't have like a mason jar the way we do today. That comes a bit later. But they did have ways of sealing up food and keeping it fairly airtight. So, Rachel, did you have anything you wanted to put in on that?
Kimberly would like to know if we've tried pickled oysters. Were we just talking about that? Is that the reason that just came to my head? No. But
I'm not a big oyster fan to begin with. And so
Same.
I've had pickled walnuts. Those are weird.
You know, oysters are one of those surprise foods of the 18th century where we get a lot of people who are putting oysters in things like ice cream. And they just oysters were such a fad food of the 18th century that they were like, we're going to put them in anything we can. It's just like nutmeg. If you can stick nutmeg in it, do it.
And in the 18th century, they pickled everything. There are recipes for something called potted beef, any kind of potted meat. Yeah, you can see Laura cringing over there. Potted meat is basically pickled meat.
And there wasn't any, you could salt it or you could pickle it. And that was basically your choices or put it in the root cellar. Yeah,
and meat gets salted or smoked. So just like we make jerky today, they were keeping meat in that way. And part of the key of a lot of these foods that you're either salting or smoking is keeping them dry and a consistent temperature. They don't need to be cold, but you need to keep them consistent. And so things like root cellars are popular because you dig a hole in the ground and the earth remains a pretty consistent temperature once you get under a certain depth, usually about 3 feet. And so if you store things down there, they will stay at the same temperature. And so this is very good for things like root vegetables, where again, you probably at home have a nice dark place that you put your potatoes and your onions and your potentially parsnips, and you can keep them there for a long time. You don't need to refrigerate them. Same thing, apples, don't need to refrigerate them. You can keep them cool, dry, in a nice dark place. They will last you through the winter. So they have, some things are very low maintenance and then other things are high maintenance. Of course, things like nuts, again, those can stay pretty well. Things like beans, you can dry them out. Just like today, you go to the grocery store and you can buy a bag of dried rice or dried beans, or you can buy a can of beans that are wet, fresh, you know. And so a lot of people were drying their beans and then keeping them that way. So they found all kinds of ways to make these foods last.
Well,
So
I'm looking at the time.
I know I was gonna
Give
hold
us
it up.
one more good view of those stewed parsnips.
And so you can see like mine are very, this one's a pretty, this is kind of like a midway.
You hold them a little, there you go, perfect.
There we go.
Beautiful.
And so this is not a terribly thin sauce, but it's just coating the parsnips. You can kind of hear it squelching a little bit as you stir it. So that's about how I like mine. But again, if you want a nice thin sauce, just add more cream to it.
Oh, I see some on screen. Oh, they look fabulous. Nice. You have to let us know how they taste, and we would love for you to share images of your stewed parsnips, or if you go back and make any of our other recipes from History in the Kitchen, you can share them to us. We are at Historic Gunston Hall on all of our social media. We have Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and tag them #History in the Kitchen, which I put both of those in the chat for you. Thank you so much. We love knowing that you guys are participating along with us. With that being said, I just want to take a moment and let everybody know, as I mentioned, this is the last History in the Kitchen session for this season. It will come back in the future. We'll be making more things with you again, so keep an eye on our website or sign up for our mailing list. You can do that at gunstonhall.org as well. I also put an evaluation.
We should pickle oysters.
I'm sorry, what was that?
We should pickle oysters.
But do let us know what you thought about this program. You can let us know in the eval that I put in the chat. Also, if you find it in yourselves to support Gunston Hall financially, we would dearly appreciate it. Your financial support helps us do research on amazing recipes like the stewed parsnips that we made today, the batter cakes from 2 weeks ago, and the peanut butter that we started this season of History in the Kitchen with. So we look forward to seeing you back for a future session.